Section 21 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Hope Bloom. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee, Section Hippopotamus. When all London and half England have been to see the hippopotamus at the zoological gardens, I feel as if a work on animals, written at the present moment, would be incomplete unless it contained some notice of this animal. Nevertheless, in spite of research into old and new books, into private reminiscences and personal recollections, I find it difficult to raise him to the intellectual place of those which have been or will be treated of in my pages. When I heard praises so lavishly bestowed upon him, when I became even reproached for not having been to see him, I began to think I had been mistaken, and that my former acquaintance with his brethren must have been made under circumstances which had caused prejudice. I therefore paid him a visit, spent some little time in watching and observing him, and came away more than ever astonished at the marvelous effects which novelty and variety will produce in the minds of men, throwing beauty and interest over the most ungainly form and good-natured stupidity. He certainly looks to greater advantage in this country than he does in his own, for here a rose-colored blush tinges his skin, and there he is too often covered with mud to wear any other appearance than that of a dirty brown. The hippopotamus is exclusively a denizen of Africa, and perfectly harmless when unprovoked, except that he sometimes gets into the plantations in the vicinity of his haunts and crushes and devours a crop of maize or millet. He would rather avoid fighting or quarreling, but, like all other brute creatures, can retaliate an injury with a fury which is rendered frightful by his enormous weight. He looks best when walking in the shallow part of a lake or river, just under the water, with his eyes open. But if there should be a boat or canoe on the surface, the sooner it bears its freight to the shore, the better. For he is sure, at least, to try and upset it with his huge back. Not that he has any murderous intentions, but he probably thinks it is an intrusion on his particular domains. The hide of the hippopotamus, of which tremendous whips are made, is at least 2 inches thick, and has no hair upon it. His legs are so short that the body of one that is full grown almost reaches the ground, and sometimes measures 5 feet across. His tail is very short and insignificant, and his eyes and ears are very small. They live together in small numbers, feed chiefly on grass and aquatic plants, and come forth at night. Each foot has 4 toes, and each toe a separate hoof. The nostrils open on the top of the muzzle. Their flesh is thought to be very good to eat and to resemble pork. A thick layer of fat lies just under the skin, which the Africans look upon as a great delicacy for the table. The male is the largest, and 2 species are said to exist. The exploits of Mr. Gordon Cumming gives us a lively picture of their habits, but there is nothing in his work which affords the slightest interest in their mental faculties. The following account from the pen of Captain Owen, who explored so large a portion of the African shores, is the only instance I have met with which wears the semblance of almost unprovoked anger on the part of a hippopotamus. While examining a branch of the Tembe River in Delagoa Bay, a violent shock was suddenly felt from underneath the boat, and in another moment a monstrous hippopotamus reared itself up from the water, and in a most ferocious and menacing attitude rushed open-mouthed at the boat. With one grasp of its tremendous jaws, it seized and tore 7 planks from her side. The creature disappeared for a few seconds, and then rose again, apparently intending to repeat the attack, but was fortunately deterred by the contents of a musket discharged in its face. The boat rapidly filled, but as she was not more than an oar's length from the shore, they, the crew, succeeded in reaching it before she sank. The keel, in all probability, had touched the back of the animal, which, irritating him, occasioned this furious attack, and he had got his upper jaw above the gunwale. The whole broadside must have been torn out. The force of the shock from beneath, previously to the attack, was so violent that her stern was almost lifted out of the water, and Mr. Tams, the midshipman steering, was thrown overboard, but fortunately rescued before the irritated animal could seize him. The hippopotamus, with his shy and secluded habits, may be easily passed as he lies concealed among the reeds which grow by the side of the river, but if once he gets into the water, he is always to be detected by the blowing noise which he makes. End of section 21.
Section 22 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee. Hogs. Nature has so strongly marked the wild and the tame hog with the same characters that no hesitation arises in pronouncing the former to be the stock from whence we have derived the latter. In common, however, with all other free and domesticated animals, there is a prolongation of muzzle in the wild species which is not to be found in those of our sties. The tusks also are larger in this instance as in all others, showing how bountifully the great Creator provides for all. The domestic hog is not required to seek his food and dig roots as his untamed brother does, and therefore the parts most used for these purposes are not equally developed. Both, however, possess very powerful muscles of the neck and shoulder to give movement to their large and strong jaws. They all have 4 toes on each foot, the 2 in the middle being much the largest and armed with strong hoofs. Their snout looks as if it had been suddenly chopped off, as if to expose the nostrils which are pierced in this truncated portion. Their triangular canine teeth or tusks project beyond the mouth, those of both jaws curve upwards. They make very formidable weapons, as many a dog and huntsman has known to his cost. Wild hogs are covered with stiff dark brown hair which gets grizzly with age, and is more upright along the back. The tail is short, and in many varieties of the domestic pig it curls very tightly. The male wild boar only associates with the female for a short period, and at other times lives alone in the thickest parts of dense forests, coming forth in the evening to procure his food, which is chiefly of a vegetable nature. It is only when pressed by hunger that wild hogs will eat animal substances. The females herd together, and their young remain with them till they are 2 or 3 years old. When they are about to be born, the mothers retreat as far as possible from the fathers, as the latter have a most longing desire always to devour their offspring. The females, left to defend themselves and their children, place the latter behind them and expose themselves in a line to the attacks of an enemy, or they form a circle round them and evince an extraordinary amount of fury and courage. Sparman, the South African traveller, asserts that the species of wild sow in those regions, when so closely pursued that it is impossible for them to make off, take the young pigs in their mouths. To his astonishment one day, when pursuing a herd, all the young ones disappeared, nor could he explain the mystery till aware of this singular fact. The hunting of wild boars has from the most ancient times been reckoned a noble sport, for it not only called for dexterity and courage, but was attended with considerable danger from the extreme savageness of these animals when at bay, and the facility with which they rip open their antagonists with their tusks. They were in former times considered as royal game, and fines were imposed on those who killed them without having the privilege of doing so. The time of their extirpation in England is uncertain, for we know that in the reign of Charles I orders were given for some domestic hogs to be turned into the New Forest, that they might become wild, but they were all destroyed in the time of Cromwell. Some still exist in the large European forests, and a variety of hounds are still trained to hunt them. Horses are particularly alarmed at them, and in the history of boar hunts we constantly read of the sportsmen being forced to alight from their steeds to take a steady aim. The numbers of ancient arms in which they are found, and the names of old places derived from them, attest their numerous presence here. For instance, Brandon, which is Brawn's den, brawn being the old term for boar. Their skin is so thick as frequently to deaden the force of bullets, which after death have been found lying between it and the flesh. The wild boars of Africa have a broader snout than their European brethren, and possess 2 protuberances under the eyes, which prevent them from seeing anything underneath them. They live in subterranean holes, and one which had been for some time kept in confinement was accidentally left loose in a small court near his cage, upon which he tore up the pavement, and had already made a deep pit when his keeper returned. When the natives of Africa spear or entrap one, they tie his 4 feet together, sling him on a pole, decorate him and themselves with creeping plants, and return to their huts with triumphant shouts and rejoicing. The flesh of these is very close-grained, white, and hard. The impossibility of keeping meat in that country till it becomes tender makes wild boar flesh almost useless to Europeans unless their teeth vie with those of Negroes. Some idea of the sort of sport which attends the chase of wild boars may be formed from the following account of one which took place in a forest in Luxembourg. At a battle, several of these animals were driven together, and they came rushing on like squadrons of heavy dragoons, breaking through the underwood. Several shots were fired, and they tried to disperse. One huntsman got out of the line, and a boar came rushing upon him, but a fresh shot broke one of its legs, which, however, though it made him more savage, caused him to turn into the forest. The well-trained dogs and the huntsman pursued him, and when they came up with him, found him terrifically savage. One of the hounds, more daring than the rest, made a dart at the beast, seized him by one ear, and bounded over him to the opposite side. They ran off together, the boar's head almost turned upside down, but with a sudden jerk the dog was shaken off, and the boar, tearing him open, tossed him several feet in the air. The pack then gathered so thickly round that the boar's progress was stayed. The men then came up and cut his throat. At another point of the wood, a sow weighing 300 pounds and followed by her young was wounded, and furiously pursued a hunter whom she surprised in a narrow pass between 2 rocks. He waited her approach and fired, or rather tried to do so, but his gun missed. He then, in an instant, fell on his face and hands, and the sow ran over his body. Rising and loading his gun, he provoked the sow again by his cries. The foaming creature with flashing eyes turned upon him, but this time she received the charge in her head and fell. Wild hogs are easily domesticated and as easily resume their uncivilized habits, but they seem then to keep in packs. Mr. Byam relates the following adventure with these renegades. Quote, I was one day hunting alone on foot in a rather open wood, when a large boar made his appearance about 60 yards off, and not seeing any of his companions, I let fly the ball and tumbled him over. He gave a fierce grunt or two as he lay, and a large herd of boars and sows rushed out of some thick underwood behind him, and after looking at the fallen beast for a few seconds, made a dash at me. But they were a trifle too late, for on catching sight of them I ran up a tree, cut up it for life, and had only just scrambled into some diverging branches about 10 feet from the ground when the whole herd arrived, grunting and squeaking at the foot of the tree. I could not help laughing at the ridiculous figure I must have made, chased up a tree by a dozen of pigs, but it soon turned out no laughing matter, for their patience was not, as I expected, soon exhausted, and they settled round the tree about 20 yards distant, and kept looking at me with their little twinkling eyes, as much as to say, "We'll have you yet." End quote. So far are Mr. Byam's own words, and I now give the sequel in a more abridged form, though by so doing I feel that I deprive the story of some of its zest. Having made up his mind to a regular siege, he examined his resources and found them to be a double-barreled gun, a flask of powder, nearly full, plenty of copper caps, a few charges of shot, only 2 balls, a knife, flint, and steel, a piece of hard dried tongue, a small flask of spirits and water, and a good bundle of cigars. He could not expect relief, a sally was out of the question, so he made himself as comfortable as he could. Hour after hour passed. The pigs never stirred, except when one or two returned to look at their dead comrade as if to sharpen their revenge. At length the imprisoned hunter thought of firing off some powder every few minutes, shouting at the same time. One barrel of his gun was still loaded with shot, and he aimed at an old boar, who, on returning from his deceased friend, had looked up at him and grunted. The whole charge, at a distance of about 20 feet, went into the boar's face, who then turned round and ran away, making a horrible noise. The rest of the party charged all together to the foot of the tree, but the outcry of the old boar drew them away, and the whole herd went after him, making such a noise as never before had saluted Mr. Byam's ears. He remained in the tree a short time, and when all was quiet he slipped down and ran away as fast as he could in a contrary direction. Hogs are not equally prized by all nations. The detestation in which they were held by the Egyptians was continued by the Israelites, not only from living with those people, but because they were unclean animals. They are still viewed in that light by Brahmins and Mussulmans, who only rear them to sell to Christians or to make scavengers of them, for in a domestic state they are omnivorous. The dislike of the latter to them was once very serviceable to me, for when we were bivouacking close to a Mohammedan village, the people and the priests thronged around us so as to be extremely troublesome, and the only way in which we could keep them at a distance without force was by tying pieces of ham over the different entrances of the building in which we were. Somewhat like rats, there seems to be a mysterious distribution of swine all over the face of the earth, and much astonishment was created in the minds of the discoverers of the South Sea Islands by finding them in those far-off specks of the earth. Perhaps there had been earlier navigators there than ourselves. Pork, fresh or cured, forms the principal food of our sailors and peasantry, and most precious is the pig to the poor man. It is often the pet of the younger branches of his family, and returns their affection with interest. Of course, it is an idle fable that pigs can see and smell the wind, but it is perfectly true that they are always much agitated when a storm is approaching. Considering the stupid way in which they run when they're frightened, the manner in which they squeak on all occasions, and the obstinacy which they evince, very often when an endeavour is made to add to their relief or comfort, it is not surprising that a low estimate of their intelligence should have been formed. Nevertheless, they have been trained to point out letters and spell words till they have acquired the appellation of learned pigs. What, however, is more useful, they draw the plough in the south of France. They are taught to hunt the truffles, which are hidden under the soil. They even stand at game like the most accomplished pointers. The latter instruction was conveyed by means of stones and pudding. If they failed in their duty, they received the former, but when they drooped their ears and tail and sank upon their knees, nor rose till the birds had already risen, they feasted on lumps of pudding. Of the voracity of pigs there are many stories, all more or less disagreeable, and none more so than when they have killed and partially eaten children, and utterly devoured their young keepers. Such stories have been too well authenticated to be doubted, but they are exceptions to the general history of the animal. It is much more pleasing to refer to the life, death, and burial of poor Jean, who was saved out of a litter of 6 born on board ship from the butcher's knife. She was brought up as a pet, and suffered to run about deck among sheep and goats. Most of the livestock was washed off, but Jean remained because she had been stowed away in the longboat. In warm latitudes the men took their meals on deck, and she was always one of the mess, poking her nose into every bread bag and scalding it in the soup. The sailors poured grog down her throat and twice made her tipsy, and she behaved as most individuals do on such occasions. In consequence of the scarcity of fresh provisions in the Chinese seas, Jean was ordered to be killed, her fry to be eaten one day, her head made into turtle soup the next, and after that her legs, etc., roasted. But the ship's company pleaded that she might be spared, stating among other reasons that when called she came like a dog. "Jean! Jean!" exclaimed the captain, and she bounced along, tripping up the officer of the watch. Like most pets, Jean became intolerably fat and lazy, in which condition she was an object of great attraction to the Chinese. They longed for her, wanted to buy her, begged for her, and watched for her, knowing she must die soon, and then be thrown overboard. Jack, however, had no inclination to gratify the Chinaman, and when poor Jean breathed her last, 2 masses of ballast iron were placed, one on each cheek, and lashed to her neck and shoulders in such a manner that by their protection they made a long, sharp snout which would penetrate into the mud. She was lowered over the ship's side head foremost, and when below the surface of the water the rope was cast off, and her well-loaded carcass went down too deep even for the search of the cunning Chinese. End of section 22. Section 23 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee. Rhinoceroses. With quite as little personal beauty as the pachydermata of which I have hitherto treated, the rhinoceros takes his place among the powerful of the earth. He has no tusks, but wears 1 or 2 horns upon his nose. Of these, when there are 2, the foremost is the largest. All are curved and polished, and appear to be formed of hairs, aggregated into a solid mass. The bones of the nose are remarkably thickened and developed into that form which is best adapted to resist a shock, namely the arch. And by this not only is the animal able to carry its horn high, but to bear the tremendous resistance with which it meets when it uses that horn. In all but one species the upper lip is prolonged, and capable of such extension that it becomes prehensile. It protrudes this lip, lowers its horn or horns so as to lean forwards, and rushes at the object of its anger or dislike with almost inconceivable fury. I have already contradicted the assertion that it seeks the elephant for the purpose of giving him battle, on which occasion it was said to sharpen its horn against a stone just before the engagement. According to Mr. Gordon Cumming's account, they inhabit the same neighbourhood without exhibiting any particular enmity towards each other. As far as we know at present, there are 6 species, all of which inhabit Africa and India, including Java and Sumatra. They have 3 toes on each foot covered with a hoof. The sides of their body project in a remarkable degree. Their skin is enormously thick, knotty in its surface, and has but a few hairs scattered over it. The Indian rhinoceroses have enormous folds of this skin hanging upon the shoulders, haunches, neck, and thighs, looking as if each fold covered a thick rope. The ears of all are erect, the eyes small and near the nose, the tail short. They carry their heads so low that they almost touch the earth. They plough up the ground with their horn, scattering stones and soil without any apparent motive, and few things can resist the impetuous force which they put forth when they rush upon an object which has excited their fury. Their smell and hearing are extremely acute, so that it is difficult to approach them, but as their sight is very limited, they may be avoided by slipping on one side when they are in pursuit of an enemy. The Javanese and Sumatran species are smaller, lighter, and consequently less ferocious and powerful than the others. Both in Africa and India there is a superstition with regard to the horns of all the species, which the natives declare are sensibly acted on by poison. It is the custom to make cups of them, and in India it is said that liquid poison poured into them effervesces in such a manner that it overflows the cup. In Africa the inhabitants assure you that the cup will turn black from the same cause, and that water drunk from them possesses medicinal properties, especially if stirred with iron. The folds on the skin of the African species are much less than those of the Indian, and amount to scarcely more than wrinkles. The latter have been known to live 100 years, and when young their skin has a pink tinge. All eat the young branches of trees and shrubs and grass. It has been observed that the skin of the African rhinoceros is so full of insects that birds are in the habit of perching upon them for the purpose of feeding on these insects. They suffer their winged friends to remain undisturbed, thinking that as long as they do, no enemy is near. But if they fly off, some danger is approaching, for which they immediately look out. These birds are not unlike the missel thrush, and remain by their friends till they are forced to leave them. When the latter are shot, They fly away, uttering a harsh cry, and return to their positions when all is quiet, even adhering to them all night. This may be also the case in India, but I've only seen it recorded of Africa. I should suppose that the loud blowing noise attributed to the African rhinoceros holds good with all. The black variety is the most dangerous. They ramble about at night and go to the river to drink between the hours of 9 and 12. Those sudden fits of frenzy to which all are liable are particularly outrageous in them, and they have been seen to attack the bushes round them for hours at a time, uttering a strange noise, something like the combination of a grunt and a whistle. Their flesh is rather like beef, perhaps having even a finer flavour. They go about singly or in pairs, are much the most active, and pursue any object which attracts them with perseverance which is quite ludicrous. According to Major Harris, much of the brain lies under the horns, and he saw them sometimes assemble in herds of 32. The best place to aim at, when it's desirable to kill them, is behind the shoulder. Before they charge, they stand rolling their body from side to side. They become furious at the sight of fire, and in order to get at it, they dash forward with mad fury, nor rest till they have scattered and extinguished all the burning wood. The white rhinoceroses have a longer neck than the others. Their muzzle is shorter and more square, resembling that of the ox. Most of the rhinoceroses brought to Europe have been remarkably good-tempered and docile, but one which was lodged in Exeter Change was only kept in order by the whip, no kindness having any effect upon him, especially in his sudden fits of fury, which were of the most frightful violence. Mr. Burchell's measurement of a rhinoceros made him 11 feet from the tip of the nose to the insertion of the tail, and the girth of the body was 8 feet 4 inches. Some years ago, says Captain Brown, a party of Europeans with their native attendants and elephants, of course this must have been India, met with a small band of 7 rhinoceroses. These were led by a larger and more powerful animal than the rest. When this large leader charged the hunters, the first elephants, in place of using their tusks as weapons, wheeled round and received the blow of the rhinoceros's horn on their hind quarters, and so powerful was the concussion that it brought them instantly to the ground with their riders, and as soon as they could get on their feet again, the brute was ready to repeat the attack, and was certain to produce another fall, and in this manner did the contest continue until 4 of the 7 were killed, when the rest made good their retreat. End of section 23.
Section 24 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Krista Zaleski. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee. Horses. Although still lingering among the Pachydermata, I have now left behind me the ponderous and unwieldy forms which inhabit the wild and wooded tracts of the earth's surface, and come to the group called Solipeda, from the one round and horny hoof which encircles all the feet. 1 toe is apparent, and 2 points on each side under the skin represent lateral toes, besides which there is, underneath, a soft pad, or what is generally termed the frog, which touches the ground when the animal walks. Strength, beauty, and activity are all combined in horses. Their elegantly shaped head, with its long pointed ears and large eyes, is carried high or thrown back, and while they rapidly glance into the horizon to look for friends or foes, their well-defined nostrils sniff fresh vigor from the passing breeze. But this is not all. These same ears laid flat back upon their head tell you that they have been affronted, and mean to be revenged for the insult. When they are upright, they are listening to sounds which their rider cannot hear, and when they are pointed forward, they rejoice in the affectionate voices of those whom they love. Those full hazel eyes denote passions of various kinds, are often turned full of parental love on the offspring which gambols by their side, or of gratitude upon their kind masters, following their benefactors with a melancholy look when they take their departure. Those nostrils are dilated sometimes with anger, at others with pleasure of the chase, and the arched neck, the broad muscular chest, the graceful curving lines of the body, the well-shaped sinewy limbs, sometimes slender and delicate in their proportions, bear these beautiful creatures over hill and dale, almost with the swiftness of a bird, while their long mane and tail float in the air, as if the creature whom they adorn were about to soar to heaven. In a state of freedom, horses are swift, fierce, and inquisitive. They herd together in large numbers. The males evince the most faithful attachment to the females, and protect them and their offspring to the death. The latter are fond and devoted mothers. In activity, there is no animal which more decidedly takes its character from its early masters or instructors. Their admirable qualities are heightened, their fierceness becomes courage, their wild actions are turned into play, and their attachment and sagacity are only surpassed by those of the dog. On the other hand, most of what are called their vices may be traced to their early training. Allowances must, of course, be made for natural disposition, which varies as much in the brute creation as it does in man. And I have met with ill-tempered horses, which have been so from the moment they were taken from their native forests. But generally speaking, the horse becomes the protector, the companion, the friend of his possessor. When dead, every part of him is useful, and when living, all of his energies make him one of the greatest blessings which a beneficent Creator has bestowed on the earthly Lord of all. Horses' teeth are so important a part of their history that although this book does not profess to treat of science, it would be incomplete if I did not briefly point out how distinctly they shew the age of the animal. First of all, however, it should be known that the mouth seems to have been expressly formed for the bit, by which man controls this admirable creature. For, corresponding with each angle of the mouth is a space between the teeth, in which it lodges with the greatest convenience. The front teeth, or incisors, begin to appear when the horse is 15 days old, and amount to 6 in number in each jaw. All, from the first, are at the top or crown hollowed into a groove. The 2 in the middle are shed and replaced at 3 years and a half. The 2 next at 4 1/2, and the 2 outside, called the corner teeth, at 7 1/2 or 8. The grooves on the crowns become effaced, and the tops of the teeth are more triangular as age increases. The females have no canine teeth, but the males always have 2 small ones in the upper jaw, and sometimes 2 in the lower. The former appear when they are 4 years old, the latter at 3 1/2. They remain pointed till the horse has attained 6 years, and when he is 10 they begin to grow loose and expose their roots. They have 6 grinders in each side of each jaw, with flat crowns, and the plates of enamel which surround the dental substance appear in them like 4 crescents. The life of horses generally lasts about 30 years, but they have frequently been known to exceed that age. Then, however, mastication has become difficult. They get lean, or what is called out of condition, and old favourites, if they are attended to as they ought to be, after long and faithful services, have their food bruised and even cooked for them. It is surprising to see what entire rest frequently does for them, even at an advanced age, and I have seen them, in consequence of it, again taken into a degree of service when they have been supposed past all work. The origin of horses is involved in so much obscurity that it has given rise to frequent speculation, not as in the dog, with regard to the type of race, but the quarter of the globe where they were first located. It appears to me that the greatest mass of opinion is in favor of Tartary, or Central Asia, where it is supposed that the only existing wild race now lives, all the rest in a state of freedom being feral, or descended from domesticated pairs, which have again become wild. Some of these are also on the steppes of Tartary, but immense numbers indicate the extensive plains of South America, which are supposed to be the descendants of the Spanish horses, and to have escaped from the conquerors of that continent. Large herds also run about in various parts of North America and Africa, and smaller numbers in England, where they have dwindled to ponies. Mr. Bell, whose authority few would dare to dispute, thinks that the Egyptians were the first people who brought the horses into subjection, and that Africa contained the original race. But the ancient mysteries of the East are only now beginning to be opened to us, and I suspect we shall find that the Egyptians derived their horses, as well as everything else, from the still older Asiatics. It would be in vain to attempt, in a work of this kind, to describe the different species and varieties of horses. I shall, therefore, quickly pass on to a small selection from the numerous anecdotes placed before me, a few of which are the results of personal experience. Before I do this, however, it may be as well to make a few observations concerning their food. They are eminently vegetable feeders, grains and dried grasses such as hay and straw, also clover being preferred when they are in constant service. The more valuable sorts are seldom much used while they are feeding entirely on green grass. They are extremely fond of the niceties which are so often bestowed on pets, such as bread, apples, cakes, etc., and some are passionately fond of sugar. M. Frederick Cuvier taught one he constantly rode to play certain tricks, rewarding him for them with sugar. And if the provision contained in his pocket were not sufficient, he would stop at a roadside inn and procure some more for the horse. Accordingly, when the sagacious animal came again to these houses, he would perform the same antics which had before procured him the sugar, and then stand still, as if again to receive his reward. While speaking of this creature, I may as well mention that he delighted in pulling down his own hay and feeding the goats which lived on the other side of his palings with it. And once, when he was fed with straw on account of some malady, his companions, who ate at the same manger, were so concerned at what they thought his inferior fare that they pushed their hay to him. Horses have not the least objection to animal food, and it has been often given to them when they have been obliged to perform immense journeys, or to undergo any very great exertion. It, however, excites them very much, and, if not judiciously bestowed, makes them fierce and uncontrollable. Stories are told of poor men who, when the despots of the East have ordered them to give up their favourite horses, have fed them on flesh and rendered them so unmanageable that the tyrants have no longer desired what they once thought a prize. Horses will also drink strong ale, etc., with the greatest relish, and oat gruel mixed with it has often proved an excellent restorative for them after an unusual strain upon their powers. They will not refuse even spirits or wine, administered in the same manner, but it is very questionable if these are equally efficacious. There is no telling, however, what strange inconsistencies domestication will produce in the matter of food, for cats have been known to refuse everything for boiled greens when they were to be had. The following account is abridged from Mr. Cole's description of those Asiatic horses which are bred in the steppes, and are private property, although he calls them quite wild. Only in the heart of Tartary can the horse be found perfectly in a wild state. One herd in the steppe will consist of 1,000 horses, but the keepers of herds will have several. Dressed in leather with a girdle which contains the implements of his veterinary art, a black lambskin cap on his head, the tabunchk, or herdsman, eats, drinks, and sleeps in his saddle, has no shelter, and dare not even turn his back upon a storm, as the creatures do for whom he is responsible. In his hand he holds a whip with a thick, short handle, and a lash from 15 to 18 feet long. Then he must have a sling, with which he takes unerring aim at each individual of his straggling herd. Then a wolf stick, with a knob of iron at the end, hangs from his saddle, and a cask of water, a bag of bread, and a bottle of brandy are necessary parts of his equipment. He pays for every horse that is lost. In 10 years he is worn out, yet is unfit for any other life. He lives in constant dread of horse stealers, notwithstanding which he steals them himself. From Easter to October the herds graze day and night in the steppes. In the winter they are sheltered at night by mounds of earth and a sort of roof from the north. The stallions and stronger horses take possession of the shed, and the rest stand outside huddled together. In severe winters sickness and death overtake them, and those who survive walk about like spectres. But when they eat the young grass, which appears when the snow is melted, they are as wild and mischievous as ever. The stallions seem to consider themselves as the chiefs of the herd, and one of these, by right of strength, is the chief par excellence. Sometimes one stallion will have affronted the rest, and all combine to turn him out, and then he will be seen apart from them, with a few mares attending him. Footnote. This seems to confirm the opinion of the Indians concerning the solitary elephants. End footnote. Occasionally 2 herds will fight for the right of pasture. The mares and foals keep aloof, the stallions flourish their tails, erect their manes, rattle their hoofs together, and fasten on each other with their teeth, the victorious party carrying off several mares. In the spring come the wolves, being very fond of young foals. So they constantly prowl round the herds, never attacking them by day if they are numerous, but come at night, and if they are scattered, they make a rush upon their victims. The stallions, however, charge at them, and they take flight only, however, to return and secure a straggling foal, to whose rescue the mother comes and herself perishes. When this is found out, a terrible battle ensues. The foals are placed in the centre, the mares encircle them, charging the wolves in front, tearing them with their teeth and trampling them with their forefeet, always using the latter and not the hind feet. The stallions rush about and often kill a wolf with one blow. They then pick up the body with their teeth and throw it to the mares, who trample upon it till its original form is utterly destroyed. If 8 or 10 hungry wolves should pull down a stallion, the whole herd will revenge him, and almost always destroy the wolves, who, however, generally try to avoid these great battles, and chase a mare or foal separated from the rest, creep up to them, imitating a watchdog and wagging their tails, spring at the throat of the mare, and then the foal is carried off. Even this will not always succeed, and if the mare give alarm, the wolf is pursued by herd and keeper, and his only chance of escape is to throw himself headforemost down the steep sides of a ravine. The horses suffer more from thirst in summer than from famine in winter. The heat is intolerable, there is no shade, and each horse tries to protect itself by its neighbor's body. In the autumn, the owners of the herd call them in to thresh corn. The turf is removed, the ground beaten till it is very hard, and a railing placed round it. The corn is spread, and 500 horses at a time are driven into the enclosure. They are terrified by the crackling straw and the noise of the whip over their heads, and the more frantic they are, the sooner is the corn threshed. The attachment of Arabs to their horses, the extreme beauty of these animals which form part of the family, and are sometimes more precious to their owners than wives or children, have become proverbial. They are managed by kindness, and nothing can exceed the indignation of the owners when they behold any attempt to manage a horse by any kind of means of the whip. It is the Arabian, which, imported through Spain or direct to England, has produced so much improvement in the European stock. An Arab mare of pure descent had, by means of the Moors, found her way to the northwestern coast of Africa, where she was purchased by an English officer. At first I was a little disappointed in her appearance, for she was thin, but as her foal became independent of her and learned to eat, she recovered her condition, and I was never tired of looking at her. To all who delight in admiring wild, unrestrained action, there could not be a much greater treat than to have the gates of the government house spur closed, and turn her and her child loose into it, while we stood upon the veranda to watch them. At no time did she ever walk, but went everywhere with a light dancing step. And on these occasions the frolics, the gestures, were past all description. Standing at one corner, her 4 feet stretched out, she would appear to wait for the pretty little son who trotted up to her, when, in a moment, almost so as to elude sight, she would bound completely over him, and take her stand at another corner, then back again, and round, till it seemed to me that all the tricks taught by Ducrot, the waltzing and quadrilling excepted, must have been suggested by watching the movements of wild horses. A curious adventure happened to that little foal, which is worthy of record. A year or 2 after this, the groom took him to the river to wash his legs, and as he turned to come out again, a crocodile bit him. He struggled for a moment and fell. This frightened the crocodile away, and the poor young horse was dragged from the water's edge. The formidable teeth of the reptile had nearly separated the foot from the leg, and it hung by one tendon. There seemed to be no alternative but to shoot him. However, a native suggested to his owner that there was a famous Moorish doctor then in the place, and if anyone could cure the horse, he could. At any rate, it was worth the trial. The man came, was very quiet, did not promise anything, but united the parts, bandaged them together, had the patient fastened down in the position in which he chose him to lie, and after some weeks of careful tending, the animal was restored to his master even without blemish. It was only by passing a hand along the parts which had been severed that the scar could be detected, and he was afterwards sold for a handsome sum. Monsieur de Lamartine tells an interesting story of an Arab chief and his horse, which is highly characteristic. They, and the tribe to which they belonged, attacked a caravan in the night, and were returning with their plunder, when some horsemen, belonging to the Pasha of Acre, surrounded them, killed several, and bound the rest with cords. Among the latter was the chief, Abu el-Merik, who was carried to Acre, and, bound hand and foot, laid at the entrance of their tent during the night. The pain of his wounds kept him awake, and he heard his own horse neigh, who was picketed at a little distance from him. Wishing to caress him, perhaps for the last time, he dragged himself up to him and said, "Poor friend, what will you do among the Turks? You will be shut up under the roof of a Khan, with the horses of a Pasha or an Aga. No longer will the women and children of the tent bring you barley, camel's milk, or durra, in the hollow of their hands. No longer will you gallop free as the wind in the desert. No longer will you cleave the waters with your breast and lave your sides as pure as the foam from your lips." If I am to be a slave, at least you may go free. Return to our tent. Tell my wife that Abu el-Merak will return no more. But put your head still into the folds of the tent, and lick the hands of my beloved children." With these words, as his hands were tied, the chief, with his teeth, undid the fetters which held the courser bound, and set him at liberty. But the noble animal, on recovering his freedom, instead of galloping away to the desert, bent his head over his master, and seeing him in fetters and on the ground, took his clothes gently between his teeth, lifted him up, and set off at full speed towards home. Without resting, he made straight for the distant but well-known tent in the mountains of Arabia. He arrived there in safety, lay his master down at the feet of his wife and children, and immediately dropped down dead with fatigue. The whole tribe mourned him, the poets celebrated his fidelity, and his name is still constantly in the mouths of the Arabs of Jericho. The Arabs have 5 noble races, among which that of Kolan is the most celebrated for its beauty, temper, courage, memory, and almost human intelligence. The value which the Arabs themselves set upon their horses may perhaps be exemplified when I say that the before-mentioned mare, Cora, had been brought to the coast in some secret manner, and as soon as it transpired where she was, a comparatively insignificant sultan of the interior sent to offer goods for her to the value of 300 pounds. When her master left Africa, he sold her to a general officer, and I never heard what became of her after that. The following is a short pedigree of one of these valuable creatures. In the name of God the Merciful, the cause of the present writing is that we witness that the grey horse Derish of Mahmud Bey is of the first breed of Negdi horses, whose mother is the grey mare Hadda the famous, and whose father is the bay horse Dabrouj, of the horses of the tribe of Beni Halid. We testify on our conscience and fortune that he is the breed concerning which the prophet said, "The true runners, when they run, strike fire. They grant prosperity until the day of judgment." We have testified what is known, and God knows who are true witnesses. 6 signatures verified this pedigree. I had marked out a selection of quotations as proofs of the highest quality of the noble horse, but I must now be as brief as possible and not profit too much by the interesting labours of others. I therefore continue my own observations. When staying on the borders of the river Gambia, I saw 2 of the native horses which belonged to the stud of the commandant there. They had been brought from the interior and taken from a wild herd, but they were totally unlike the races hitherto described. The mare, of a reddish-brown, had been some time domesticated, and was docile and well-behaved, neither of them possessing sufficient character to be referred to the Barb, the Dongola, or the Nubian breeds. They were undersized and not handsome. The male, who had not been long from his native forests, was the best-looking, carried his head well, was strongly and compactly made, especially about the shoulders, and there was much fire about the head, which, however, was far from handsome. His legs were slender and well-shaped. The peculiar circumstances in which I was placed rendered it necessary that I should, for the sake of health, take horse exercise. There was nothing which could carry me except this little grey horse, for I could not persuade those around me to let me mount Cora, because they said she had so hard a mouth. So a side saddle was put on, and a man with a skirt tried the grey once or twice. He was tolerably quiet, and without much disturbance he went pretty well for a few weeks, the only trouble being to get upon his back. He, however, had one great peculiarity which manifested itself rather awkwardly when a party of us started to go to a distance. He could not endure strangers, and would not suffer any of his own kind to approach him who did not live in the same stable as himself. This was great affectation in a horse just wild from the woods, but so it was. The instant my companions approached me, he made a bolt. His heels went into the air, and it was in vain to resist his fancy. We returned the next day, and while fording a creek, which we had crossed in a canoe the day before, one of our party forgot my horse's peculiarity and came up to me. He darted fairly out to sea, and not till he found himself off his legs was he frightened. Fortunately, alarm made him tractable, and I easily turned his head and landed in safety. Wishing, however, to punish him, I galloped him home 4 miles through loose sand, which was over his fetlocks. Far, however, from being subdued, when I had dismounted and went to pat his cheek, he tried to bite me. The beauty and excellence of English horses taken as a whole have been acknowledged to surpass those of the rest of the world. Their speed, their enormous leaps, their long journeys, their strength have been frequent themes of admiration. and I regret that I cannot fill more pages with the histories that are recorded of them. But there are many excellent books on that subject alone, which may be read with great advantage. And I pass on to a very clever hunter called Nanny, who belonged to my father, and who performed a feat thought in my childhood to be unique, but which I have of late seen mentioned in the papers as accomplished by other horses. In those days, gentlemen seldom retired from the dinner table without being at least elated, and on occasion of this sort my father, by way of summing up his favourite's wonderful abilities, said he was sure she would, at his bidding, jump over the supper table, which was then set out for about 20 persons. Being an only daughter, I was often allowed to exceed the hours at which children are usually sent to bed, and I was therefore present during the whole scene. Doubts were expressed, bets were laid, the parties became excited, and Nanny was ordered from her stable, bridled and saddled as if for her master's riding. She was led into the room, the gentlemen were all assembled, the table was glittering with lights, glass, and silver. The room was also brilliant, and at first Nanny was a little surprised. The chairs were set on each side of the room, but as the seats were pushed under, they only added to the height. My father mounted, and said, "Over, Nanny." The docile creature poised herself on her hind legs, stretched out her neck as if to measure the distance, and cleared the hole, the only ill effect arising from which was that the marks of her hoofs were left in the carpet. This clever mare constantly opened the door of her stable and went to warm herself at the fire in the harness room, but her affection for her master had more than once preserved his life. On one occasion it is supposed he had slipped off her and been unable to get on again, when, overcome with sleep, he folded his arms, rested them against her side, and laying his head upon them remained there in a sound slumber. It was presumed that they had been in this posture a long time, and, had she moved, his life would probably have been endangered by the fall, for they were close to a steep declivity. On another occasion she came home, neighed at the door of the dwelling, and did not offer to go to the stable. The family were aroused, servants rose, she trotted back and stood by her master, who was lying senseless by the side of the road. They must have fallen together, as on his chest was the mark of one of her feet, probably made in getting up again. He was only stunned, and in a few days recovered from his fall, while she was more than ever loved. She was a chestnut mare with a white star, and very like her was another called Peggy, which, from having belonged especially to our mother, we as children claimed as ours also. And I have always, when recollecting her, been able to picture to myself the intimacy between horses and human beings in an Arab family. We crawled over her, we seated ourselves upon her without bridle or saddle, we clung to her neck when she had no room for us on her back, and we sat upon her as she herself lay in her stall. When she was ill, we administered the medicine, almost quarrelling as to who should take the gruel to her. When she heard our voices, whatever pain she was in, she saluted us with a neigh. She was patient under every infliction, accommodated herself to every fancy, and with her prudence and good temper was often instrumental to our safety. Although she had been a hunter and was a lady's horse, she went well in harness, and used to run in a curricle, with all the fiery spirits whom my father chose to drive. And we must have been dashed to pieces more than once, but for her steadiness and forbearance. At last we were obliged to part with her. That is, we were going to live where we could not keep her, and a friend took her into his park, where she was to remain free all the rest of her life. 5 years after, I was sitting at an open window in the neighbourhood of the metropolis, and a sound met my ear. "If ever I heard Peggy's step," I exclaimed, "that is it. She is now coming along the road." I was disbelieved, but in 1 minute after, the still beautiful creature, though 33 years old, was at the gate. We rushed to her, we called her, she answered us. She danced about, she rubbed her face against ours, she looked for the same caresses, the same niceties which she used to get from us, and half an hour quickly passed in mutual caresses. The gentleman in whose park she had been living had found her so fresh that he had ridden her by easy journeys to London, and during his few days' visit sent her to see us. She lived 2 years after that, and died of old age without a struggle. A friend told me the other day that a horse had been in the habit of going with his master a certain road, and stopping at the same inn, where those who fed him always threw some beans into the corn they put before him. After a time he and his master went from that part of the country and remained away for 2 years. Then the same habits were resumed, and the same inn frequented. The latter, however, had changed its owners. While enjoying his dinner, the rider was informed that his horse would not eat, that he appeared to be perfectly well, but there was something wrong about the corn, which they knew not how to rectify, for it was the very best. The gentleman went to the stable, the horse neighed, looked at him, then at the manager, and it struck him suddenly that the animal missed the food he had been accustomed to receive there, and nowhere else. "Throw some beans in," he said to the hostler. He was obeyed, and the horse looked at him as if to express his thanks, and took his meal contentedly. I terminate these anecdotes with one concerning a cart horse, which I never saw in print but once. He had frequently given proofs of great sagacity, but the chief was the following. During the winter, a large wide drain had been made, and over this strong planks had been placed for our friend, the cart horse, to pass over to his stable. It had snowed during the night, and had frozen very hard in the morning. How he passed over the planks on going out to work I know not. But on being turned loose from the cart at breakfast, he came up to them, and I saw his forefeet slip. He drew back immediately, and seemed for a moment at a loss how to get on. Close to these planks a cartload of sand had been placed. He put his forefeet on this, and looked wistfully to the other side of the drain. The boy who attended this horse, who had gone round by another path, seeing him stand there, called him. The horse immediately turned round, and set about scraping the sand most vigorously, first with one hind foot and then with the other. The boy, perhaps wondering what he was going to do, waited to see. When the planks were completely covered with sand, the horse turned round again, unhesitatingly walked over, and trotted up to his stable and driver. End of section 24.
Section 25 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee. The Ass. Although far from equaling the horse in grace or beauty, the ass in his wild condition is a handsome, swift, and powerful animal, so different to the degenerated, ill-used, and scrubby creatures of this country that they would scarcely be recognized as belonging to the same stock, if placed side by side. In Spain and other parts of southern Europe and the Cap de Verde Islands, they are very superior, but they are even surpassed by those of the East. All acquainted with Scripture know the importance formerly attached to them, when the wisest and best of the land rode in state upon white asses. It will also be recollected that the Israelites were at first forbidden to use horses, and the places of the latter were then supplied by asses. From the time, however, that the finer animals became common, asses seem to have fallen into disrepute, and we read that the greatest of all beings, when performing his divine mission upon earth, and was about to give himself up as a sacrifice for us, rode into Jerusalem upon an ass, thereby showing his humility. Asses are eminently creatures of a warm climate, where they have a smooth, sleek coat, well-made legs, and elevated carriage of the head. They were introduced into Great Britain at an early period, for we hear of 12 shillings being paid for one in the time of Ethelred, but they are supposed to have become extinct and to have been reintroduced in the reign of Queen Mary, in consequence of our then intercourse with Spain. They are still in great perfection in Persia, where there are 2 varieties, one kept for riding, the other for carrying burthens. The former are very strong, lift their legs well, and are broken in as horses are, but the best are said to be natives of Arabia. They are not all larger than ours, a smaller variety being frequently met with, nor have they all the dark streak across the shoulders. They are of a pale yellow, silvery gray, brown, and reddish colors. The celebrated white asses are albinos. All have a short black mane, a dark streak upon the back, and their tail, which so particularly distinguishes them from horses, is covered with short hair except at the tip, which is adorned with a tuft, generally dark in color. Their peculiar cry, or bray, is produced by 2 small cavities in their windpipes. Their hoofs are in Damascus made into rings, which the lower classes wear under their armpits or around their thumbs to save them from the rheumatism. Their flesh is much esteemed as food among the Persians and Tartars. They are fond of congregating near Lake Aral in the summer, but go further to the south in winter. Vast hordes exist in Tartary, each headed by a chief. They are also numerous in America, having probably been left there by the Spaniards. Mr. Bell describes an ass which belonged to his grandfather, who was so swift that matches were made against him by the possessors of the fastest asses which could be found, but he beat them all, and even followed the hounds coming up in gallant style at the death of the fox. The well-known antipathy between the horse and the ass is scarcely to be explained, and has been often overcome. Nevertheless, it always more or less exists, and many instances are on record in which it has caused inconvenience. One of these I can supply, which occurred when I was in Portugal. I started on a donkey to make a drawing of the great aqueduct which supplies Lisbon with its delicious water, and just as I had chosen my position and established myself, my husband rode up on a beautiful and valuable horse belonging to a friend. He wished to procure some specimens of the neighbouring rocks, and not liking to take a borrowed animal among them, he desired my donkey guide to hold his steed as well as mine. The boy obeyed, and Mr. Bowditch soon disappeared among the hollows. For a few minutes the horse stood quietly enough, but from the beginning he gave very significant glances at the companion forced upon him. At last he worked himself into a complete passion, snorted, pranced, reared, tossed his head, dilated his nostrils, and tried to reach the ass with his 4 feet. He was prevented from doing this by the boy, who opposed him with much temper and courage. He then tried to turn round and kick the object of his indignation, who was by no means disposed to take the insult quietly. The boy let go the ass, who gave one fling at the horse and then went very quietly to nibble the grass, lying in patches on the rough ground. The horse, however, now tried to get at the donkey, broke his bridle, pursued him, and both scampered off, the former doing just the very thing Mr. Bowditch wished to avoid. I was obliged to start up suddenly to get out of their way. My pencils and paper all made independent excursions, and the only thing to be done was for me to catch the donkey and the boy to catch the horse. Mine was much the easiest task, but both being accomplished, we kept them apart, the ass standing quietly enough, but the horse refusing to behave himself unless the boy mounted on his back and rode him up and down on the smoothest path he could find. At length Mr. Bowditch returned, and thought all that had passed a good joke, in which I could not agree with him. He rode away, and I quietly finished my sketch. Bishop Heber gives the following description of an ass which he saw in a paddock near Bombay, and which portrays a different disposition. He says, quote, "It was a noble wild ass from Cutch, as high as a well-grown Galloway, a beautiful animal, admirably formed for fleetness and power, apparently very gentle and fond of horses, and by no means disliked by them, in which respect the asses of India differ from all others of which I have heard. The same fact has been told me of the wild ass in Rajputana." Unquote. Of the power of the ass to bear fatigue, the history of Mr. Wilson is an instance. He drove one, which was his own property, in a light gig from Ipswich to London and back again, a distance of 140 miles in 2 days. The ass went at a pace little short of that of a good gig horse, and fed well in different stages. On his return he came in without the aid of a whip at the rate of 7 miles an hour, and performed the whole journey with ease. He was 12 hands and a half high, and half bred Spanish and English. Asses, although they do credit to good feeding, can live on very little, and that little of inferior quality. They have a decided manner of refusing to move when they are overloaded, and they are often seized with an immovable fit without having any apparent reason for it. In steep places they are invaluable, and their feet more sure than those of men would be. I have seen them put both their 4 feet out together and let them slip, then drag their hind feet up to them, and repeat this process on descending the vitrified and almost perpendicular roads of Madeira, taking a zigzag direction across the road each time. Mules do the same, and perhaps derive the faculty from their asinine blood. There cannot be a better proof of the intellect of asses than by showing them to be fond of the fine arts. Therefore the account of one at Chartres must enter into this work. Quote, "He used to go to the Château d'Oirville to hear the music that was often performed there. The owner of the chateau was a lady who had an excellent voice, and whenever she began to sing he never failed to draw nearer the window and listen very attentively. Once, when a piece was performed, which no doubt pleased him better than any he had heard before, he left his ordinary post, walked without ceremony into the music-room, and in order to add to the concert what he thought perhaps might be an improvement, he began to bray with all his might." Unquote. End of section 25. Read by Sandra, Montreal, 2022. Chapter 26 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instincts of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee. Camels, Dromedaries. A peculiarity in the digestive organs of some animals causes all those who possess it to be thrown together into one large order by naturalists. They have no front teeth except in the lower jaw, and in place of them the upper jaw is provided with a bony pad. A very few have canine teeth, and their grinders are marked with double crescents. They have 2 hoofs, but as the inside edge of these is flattened, they look as if they had only one cleft down the middle. The foot underneath is provided with elastic pads, connecting the toes together and extruding beyond them at the sides. These cushions at each step expand, support the animal in yielding sand, and protect it on harder ground. After they have taken their food, these ruminatia, as they are called, lie down and remain in a state of complete repose, in order to chew it a second time, and the process is thus accomplished. They have 4 stomachs. The first is called the paunch, and is the largest of all. Into it descend the grass, herbs, and leaves, when first cropped and imperfectly masticated. Thence the mass goes into the second stomach, or honeycomb, so named because its structure gives it the appearance of that substance. It is small and globular, and by means of its cells squeezes the food into little balls, which are thrown up into the mouth of the animal to receive a second mastication, called chewing the cud. After this has been effected, it descends into the third stomach, or the fec, which looks something like the several leaves of a book. Lastly, it goes into the 4th stomach, which is merely wrinkled. It is in this that real digestion takes place, all the previous labor having been but a mere preparation for it, and indicated by the name of the order, taken from a Latin word signifying to chew over. It would seem impossible for any animals to be more useful to man than the dog or the horse, yet these ruminatia are still more precious to him, for while they serve him as beasts of burden or transport, they perform agricultural labors and supply him generally with a variety of food. Milk, butter, cheese, and the very best meat, the strongest yet most delicate leather, that most valuable commodity, wool, hair, horn, and a long list of utilities all proceeding from them, while the extreme beauty of many of the genera and the sport they afford contribute to his mere pleasure as well as his comfort. The camels and dromedaries, which come first before me, are confined but to a small portion of the earth's surface. They, however, in their more confined sphere, afford incalculable benefits. Without them we should not be able to traverse those large plains of sand which lie between the different countries of Africa, and also of southwestern Asia. Their gaunt and angular form does not class them among the beauties to which I have alluded, and the only pretensions which their outward appearance can present for praise is their admirable adaptation for the offices which they have to perform. Their full upper lip is cleft, their neck is long, their eyes prominent and shaded with eyelashes, their nostrils are like slits which they can close at pleasure, their body has 1 or 2 humps on it, their legs have callous pads upon them, their feet are large and spreading, and their hair hangs loosely upon them in patches. That long upper lip, however, when the hot blast of the desert almost dries their mouth, plunges into the sand and finds momentary relief by getting below the surface. That long ungainly neck raises the head so that the prominent eyes may see objects in the far distance. Those nostrils are apertures to the most acute organs of smell, by which they can even ascertain that water is near. Those callous pads enable them to kneel when they are to be laden or mounted, and those ugly humps are provisions of fat, which supply them with nourishment if during their long journeys there is a scarcity of provisions. One of their most invaluable properties is the length of time which they can go without drinking, owing to the large secretion of water in their honeycomb stomach, while in times of intolerable privation they may be killed, and so save their masters from starvation. The camel has 2 humps, the dromedary 1. The last is the lightest and the swiftest, and is generally chosen for riding, while the former carries the burdens. High saddles are placed on their backs, and it requires either to be used to them or to be particularly careful not to be half killed at starting. The rider places himself in the saddle while the camels are kneeling, and when they raise their hind legs, which they do first of all, they send the unprepared traveller forwards, and his breath is almost taken out of him by the blow which he receives upon his chest. Then, as they get upon their forelegs, they throw him back, so as to endanger his spine. Their pace is at first very disagreeable, being so long and slouching, but generally speaking they are extremely docile and affectionate. They, however, will not stir if they think they are overloaded, and if they are made angry they are furious, especially against each other, quarrelling much more frequently with their own species than they do with man. Their owners are always very careful to see that their humps are in good condition before they set off on a journey, and some varieties are preferred to others on account of their being able to bear a longer period of drought. They are generally decorated with bells, the sounds of which in their desert journeys are said to be very agreeable to them. If once they fall from fatigue or sickness, they seldom rise again. But as a whole party, particularly when every day's provision of water is measured, cannot be stopped for one, they are left alone to die, their eyes following the masters who are obliged to abandon them, and whom they have served so faithfully, the vultures already hovering over them, ready to pick their bones as soon as they've sent forth their last breath. Their spine, when again found, is often raised upon a pole as a charm against the withering spell of the evil eye. The load of a camel is about 800 pounds, and their usual pace nearly 3 miles an hour, but at this rate they continue for 9 or 10 hours. Their color is chiefly a reddish-brown or gray, rarely black, and occasionally white. They are natives of the countries which they inhabit, the dromedary coming from Arabia and Africa, the camel from the middle of Asia to the north of the Himalaya mountains. They are said to harbor revenge, but if this once be gratified, they soon return to good humor. End of section 26. Read by Sandra, Montreal, 2022.
Section 27 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Hope Bloom, Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee, section Llamas, etc. Llamas are called the camels of the New World, and under this common name are included more than one species. They exist in large herds and are much more sightly than the animals to which they are compared. Their backs are straighter, their heads very handsome, and their fleeces are thick and equal. They will carry a load of 150 pounds, and were the only beast of burthen found among the Peruvians, when these people were conquered by the Spaniards. Their feet differ from those of the camel, but are equally adapted to the soil which they have to traverse. They are formed of 2 springy toes, each of which has a rough cushion underneath, and a strong, short hoof on the tip, pointed and hooked like a claw. These take firm hold of the rapid and precipitous ascents and descents, which they encounter in traveling to and from the mines, in which journeys they carry 100 pounds of metal over the rugged mountain passes, and perform a distance of about 12 miles during the day. At one time, 300,000 were employed by the Potosi mines alone. In one respect, they imitate camels by lying down and refusing to stir when they are overloaded, and they never go beyond their usual pace. They spit in the face of their riders when tied up or made to lie down, which is particularly disagreeable from the nature of their saliva. The different species are not clearly defined, and we require a more intimate knowledge of them before we can separate them from each other. The domestic animals are certainly llamas. Then there are guanacos, which are also called huanacos. They live on mountains, but frequently pasture in plains. And when the females do this, the males watch from a more elevated position. And if they see men approaching, nay, something like a horse, to warn them of their danger, they descend into the valley and drive their charge before them. Besides these two are the vicunas, spelt also Vicunhas, and vicunas, who are of a tawny red color and live in the bleak, cold parts of mountains, preferring frost and snow. They are remarkably swift and timid, and their wool is very fine and silky. To these must be added the paco, or alpaca, and the taruga, who are larger and even swifter than the vicunas, and wander about singly among steep and rocky places. M. Frederick Cuvier thinks there are but 3 species: the guanaco, which in a domestic state is the llama, the paco or alpaca, and the vicuna. I am desirous of dwelling thus much upon these divisions, because the readers of South American travels are often much puzzled by the manner in which they are mentioned. The guanacos, when they have plenty of the rushy grass on which they love to feed, never require any drink, but they have no cells in their stomach for the secretion of water. They are particularly active in throwing out their saliva at the least offense. They give very severe blows with their forefeet, and I have often, with the above gentleman, watched them fight with a fury which was at first laughable, tearing large mouthfuls of hair from each other, and at last obliged to be separated from the injuries they were likely to give and receive. The great enemy of these animals is the puma, and they fly from him. But Mr. Darwin says he has often known them not only neigh and squeak when men approach, but dance and leap about in the most absurd manner. They are easily caught, for they get quite bewildered when pursued, but they are much bolder when in captivity. They appear to have favorite spots to which they go to die, and which are perfectly white with their bones. This has been observed close to the river Galileo and elsewhere. Manufactures from their hair more resemble silk than woolen stuffs, and some of those made of the alpaca fleece are quite black without having been dyed. It has been a matter of surprise to many that they are not naturalized in this country, as the climate would not be an obstacle to success. The demand, however, for their produce so much increases that it is very probable they may, at some future time, become denizens of our mountainous districts. End of section 27.
Section 28 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee. Deer. The elegant animals included under the name of deer afford the highest sport to the hunter, the most precious skins and delicious food. Considering their size, they are matchless in speed and vigor, and are as beautiful as they are swift. They are spread all over the globe except Australia and Central and Southern Africa, their place in the latter continent being supplied by giraffes and antelopes. They leave the higher mountains to goats, live on moderate elevations, but delight most in wide open countries. The fissures, or what are called lachrymals, exist in most of them. They are clefts below the eyes which bear the name of tear ducts, but their use is not yet understood. They would not be so much developed as they are in many unless they bore strongly upon the animal's economy, but they do not communicate with the nose, nor are they in any way connected with respiration. They are certainly in relation with glands, because they secrete a greasy fluid, more abundant at some times than at others, when the edges are much swollen, and the animals often touch objects with them, stretching them wide open, doing so when they are under excitement of any kind. The muzzles of some deer are nearly flat and destitute of hair. In others they are covered with hair, and the upper lip is prehensile. Only the male deer have horns or antlers, as they're called, which they shed every year, and up to a certain age, at every renewal, they increase in size and number of branches. They are placed on a bony pad upon the forehead, which is covered with skin, and in the second year of their age this skin swells, blood rushes towards the pads, their arteries increase, and rapidly deposit bony matter. The antlers begin to form, the skin increases with them and continues to cover them, and the large arteries which it carries with it make furrows upon the bony matter which always remain. So thick and soft is the pile of hair which protects the skin that it deserves and has received the name of velvet. When the antlers have attained their yearly size, the arteries begin to deposit a rough ring of bone round the edges of the pad, which increases till it stops their passage, so that, deprived of its natural nourishment, the velvet shrivels up, dries, and peels off, a process which the deer hastens by rubbing his antlers against trees. The latter are then hard and serviceable, for had they been used and wounded when their covering was so full of blood, the shock would have sent a rush of it back to the brain and probably have killed the deer. Before I understood this arrangement, I have seen these animals with wounded horns, and have wondered much at the large flow of blood which issued from them, and others have probably done the same. When the skin is gone, the antlers remain as it were mechanically, and as it is one of the great laws of life to throw off everything which is no longer a part of itself, they obey the rule. Absorption takes place beneath the bony ring, particle after particle disappears, and down go the antlers, either from their own weight or some accidental touch. The part where they stood is quickly covered with skin till spring returns, when a new growth commences and a larger pair ensues. The common stag loses his antlers early in the spring, and they sprout forth again very soon after. There is no part of the game laws of various countries more stringent than that which relates to the killing of deer or their management. Whatever concerned venerie, as it was called, was a necessary part of a nobleman's or gentleman's education. The private histories of kings are very much mixed up with the deer laws, and also some of the public transactions, for many a fine has been paid, many a worthy person sent into exile, and many a life lost, in consequence of their infringement, and the technicalities with which the science and the laws were loaded appear in the present times most absurd and tiresome. Deer are still to be found wild in Scotland, but most rarely in England. In the north of Europe and America they are common, and those which frequent cold countries have the antlers much flattened, as if to shovel away the snow. They will sometimes weigh 60 pounds. These animals are everywhere tenacious of life, and will run a long way after being hit in a mortal part. Reindeer, which form the wealth of the Laplanders, serve them for food and clothing, draw them over pathless fields of snow in safety, and are the only species really domesticated. They eat a lichen which they find under the snow during the winter, and live together in large herds. They are the least handsome of the whole tribe, are perfectly obedient, and one man sometimes possesses as many as 2,000. Their joints crack as they move, and they are extremely fond of salt, even taking it from the hands of strangers. They usually run at the rate of 10 English miles the hour, but have gotten 19, and drawn a weight of 300 pounds. But they require good driving, and sometimes dash on perfectly regardless of the comfort of those in the sledge. Their smell is very acute, and by it they are enabled to come up with their party if they should have been left behind. They suffer intensely from insects, especially from a large species, Oestrus tarandi, which deposits its eggs in the hole made by its bite. In order to avoid these pests, the reindeer are driven during the summer months to the mountains which overhang the coasts, where their foes are much less numerous. They are so terrified at their approach that the sight of one will make them furious. Mr. Wenzel says that the Dog-Rib Indians go in pairs to kill reindeer, the foremost carrying in one hand the horns and part of the skin of a head of the deer, and in the other a small bundle of twigs, against which he from time to time rubs the horns, as the deers do. His companion follows exactly in his footsteps, holding the guns of both in a horizontal position, so that the muzzle of each projects under the arm of the first. Both have a fillet of white skin round their foreheads, and the foremost a strip of the same round each wrist. They gradually approach the herd, raise their legs very slowly, and put them down again suddenly in the manner of deer. If any of the herd see them, they stop, and the head is made to play its part by copying their movements. By these means the hunters get into the very centre of the herd without exciting suspicion. The hindmost man then pushes forward his comrade's gun, and both fire nearly at the same instant. The deer scamper off. The hunters trot after them. The poor animals soon halt to see what alarmed them. Their enemies have reloaded their guns as they proceeded, and give them a second discharge. The consternation of the deer increases. They run about in the utmost confusion, and the greater number are frequently thus destroyed. I have already spoken of dogs which attach themselves to communities, and now I have a similar instance of a deer to offer, in combination, however, with a dog, who attached himself to the 42nd Highlanders, having been presented to that regiment by a friend of one of the officers. The dog had belonged to a captain in the navy who dined at the mess, while the regiment was stationed in Malta, and so attached himself to that community that nothing could induce him to leave it. So his master was forced to leave his favourite Newfoundland behind him, who from that moment would never follow anyone who did not wear the uniform of his friends. The soldiers subscribed and gave him a collar with the name of the regiment on it, and called him Peter. A mutual attachment soon took place between the deer and the dog, and they regularly appeared on parade together. The latter frequented the cook-house, where the cook ill-treated him, which was not forgotten, and one day when the bathing time was come, at which recreation Peter was the first in and the last out of the water, the cook joined the others of his corps, and Peter, knowing his power in his own element, pulled him down and would have drowned him had not the soldiers come to his rescue. Both dog and deer marched with the band and remained with it when in quarters. The latter was very fond of biscuit, but if it had been breathed upon he would not touch it, and although many ways of cheating him were tried, he invariably detected the contamination. At one time he became very irritable, and if a stranger passed between the band and the main body of the regiment, he attacked him with his antlers. He was grazing one day when a cat from the neighbourhood bristled up her hair and set up her back at him, and the poor deer, seized with a sudden and unaccountable panic, sprang over a precipice 200 feet high and was killed on the spot. Peter, being close by, rushed to the battlements and barked and yelled most piteously. His own end was a tragic one. He snarled at an officer who had often ill-used him, and the unfeeling man ordered the poor dog to be shot by those who loved him, and lamented him as long as they lived. The smallest of the deer species lives in Ceylon, a lovely, delicate little creature with lustrous eyes and of exquisite form. When full grown it is only 10 inches high, 14 long, and weighs about 5 pounds. Its throat, head, and neck are all white. Its body is grey, striped with black, and spotted at equal distances with yellow. Although very timid, it is to be tamed. But if angry, it kicks out its little hind legs and slender pointed hoofs with great violence. One which was domesticated was placed on a dinner table, where it ran about and nibbled fruit from the dishes, answered to its name, and returned the caresses which were bestowed upon it. Its terror of dogs was at first very great, but at last it allowed a small terrier to come close to it and heard the bark of others without being uneasy. A pair were brought to England, but soon died from inflammation of the lungs, the common and fatal disease which attacks almost all tropical animals in this climate. End of section 28. Read by Sandra.
Section 29 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jack Ball. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals by Mrs. Roberts Lee. Giraffes. Some years ago, giraffes were thought to be fabulous animals, and the ill-treated Le Vaillant was supposed to have invented them, in spite of the description which the Romans left of them. He was a little poetical in his style of writing, which John Bull is not fond of when facts are narrated, so John Bull begged to doubt his assertions. He lived, however, to see his veracity established, which the kind old man, a year or two before his death, assured me was a great happiness to him. Lord Caledon brought a skin home from the Cape, and badly as it was stuffed, it began to dawn on the minds of Europeans that such an animal really existed. Then a live one was brought to Paris, and another to His Majesty George IV, who petted his till it died. Now there are several living in our zoological gardens, some of whom were born in the menagerie. The great peculiarity of the giraffes lies in possessing a very short body and very long legs, which formation involves a multitude of awkward movements. For instance, when they walk fast, there is a jerking in the pace, as if it were not easy to them, and when they gallop, the hind feet often project beyond the forefeet. Their very long neck is not arched, but bends obliquely from the shoulders, so that when they wish to drink from the ground, they are obliged to hold their forelegs very widely apart. They look best when going slowly, at which time their step is very stately, and their beautiful head is borne loftily above other animals. They have 2 short bony horns covered with skin, and a prominence of bone on the top of the forehead. They have large full eyes, which, owing to their convex form, they can see immense distances in all directions. Their ears are long and flexible, and they have a long black prehensile tongue. With this they drag down the branches of the trees on which they browse. Their upper lip is very flexible, and projects over the under, which greatly assists them in procuring their food. Their tail is long, and has a tuft at the end. Their skin is very glossy, is covered with large angular spots, and is often 1.5 inches thick. Their great enemy is the lion, who springs upon them when they are drinking, and the affrighted giraffes start with all the speed of a swift courser, their enemy on their back, nor stop till they fall from exhaustion or loss of blood. They were never heard to utter a sound, and therefore are supposed to be perfectly mute, even when wild. I was in Paris when the giraffe sent to that country arrived. She and her keeper, Atty, landed at Bordeaux amidst most enthusiastic acclamations, which accompanied them all the way to the metropolis. A deputation from each large town through which she passed, formed of the municipal authorities, met her, and one of the most learned savants went all the way from the Jardin des Plantes, and accompanied her on her triumphal march. La Giraffe, however, did not appreciate these honours, and she was often impatient under the etiquette imposed on her. On one occasion she broke loose from her cavalcade, Atty and all, and dashing among the horsemen, scattered them right and left, some on and some off their steeds. A dignified mayor lay in the dust, and by his side rolled the painstaking savant who performed so long a journey in her service. The enthusiasm did not abate when she reached her destination. 13,000 more than the usual weekly number passed over the Pont d'Austerlitz alone, and as the public curiosity did but increase for 6 weeks, steps were obliged to be taken to prevent the multitude from pressing upon her. There were several natives of the East at that time in the French capital, and they went among others to see her. The moment she beheld their turbans, she stretched her neck out and licked their foreheads, no doubt recognizing their headdresses. Her love for roses was very great, and she eagerly snatched them from those who carried or wore them, to their great astonishment, for few could calculate on the distance which she could reach. I went one day into her park, holding some carrots in my hand, some of which I fed to her, then turning to the cows, lying at some distance, who had come with her to afford a supply of milk for her on the voyage. I began to give some to them. Without moving her legs from the place where I had left her, she stretched her long neck and head over my head, and hooking the carrots up with her tongue, surprised me not a little, for I could not tell what shadow was coming over me. She was as fond of onions as of carrots, and this is not surprising, for they are very sweet and mild in her native country. Her Darfur attendant, Atty, slept in a gallery at the top of her stables, and there was very little repose for him after daylight. She routed him up with her nose, and seemed to think that because she was stirring, he ought also to be on the alert. This was rather against his ideas on the subject, as he was apt to stay out late at the dances in the neighbouring guinguettes, and he used to complain, and all the time loving her very dearly. End of section 29. Section 30 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instincts of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jack Ball. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instincts of Animals by Mrs. Roberts Lee. Antelopes. The many characters which antelopes possess in common with deer seem to place them together, but naturalists have ranked them among those ruminantia who have hollow horns. They are some of the most beautiful animals in the world, and are subdivided into sections which depend on the shape of their horns, but into which classification the present work does not enter. The exquisite gazelle, the type of Eastern beauty, the poet's theme, with her slight and graceful shape, her slender limbs, and her full, dark eyes, often meets with a fate which has no poetry in it, for she is the favourite morsel of the lion and the leopard. It might have been thought that they would have preferred larger and more fleshy game, but like true epicures, the high flavour of the gazelle is preferred to size. The falcon is often used by men for catching them, as even the swift greyhound cannot overtake them. They are also driven into traps by surrounding them, in the manner of a battle. Their skin is used in the making of a peculiar sort of drum. The pygmy antelope inhabits some parts of Africa, and, in size, corresponds with the small deer of Ceylon. I never saw so beautiful a little creature, appearing more like a fable than a reality. Their tiny black horns are but slightly curved inwards. Their legs are not thicker than the quill with which I am now writing, and yet all the characters of the antelope are strongly marked. The first I saw had been brought to my uncle, and as I entered his room, I stood quite still at the door, with surprise at this exquisite, tiny creature, who remained with one leg up, ready to dart away with the speed of lightning from the intruder, for whose approach he was listening. I feared to move, lest the vision should disappear, but death soon made it fade away altogether. Captain Fisher of the Navy tried to take a pair of these fairy-like creatures to England. They were kept in his own cabin. He gave them all the goat's milk which had been provided for his own use, and took infinite pains to shelter them from cold or accidents. He succeeded in getting them as far as the Channel, where they ate some pieces of cork which had been dropped on the floor, and died. I was equally unfortunate with a beautiful spotted antelope which was brought to me, and which never could stand in the house. It had not been hurt, but the instant it was put upon its legs it slipped about, and I was told this species always did so. I fed it, carried it about, and it was very gentle, and began to know me, though still wild. It died at the end of a fortnight, in strong convulsions. Antelopes are exclusively inhabitants of the Old World, and some idea may be formed of their immense numbers in South Africa, where the species are most varied and powerful, by reading the following quotations from Mr. Pringle and Mr. Gordon Cumming. The former says, "We pursued our journey over extensive plains, still parched by severe drought, and undulating heights clothed with the brown and scanty herbage, and sprinkled over with numerous herds of springbok. Near the banks of the Little Fish River, so numerous were those herds that they literally specked the face of the country as far as the eye could reach, insomuch that we calculated we had sometimes within view not less than 20,000 of these beautiful animals. As we galloped on, they bounded off continually on either side, with the velocity from which they derive their colonial appellation. They were probably part of one of the great migratory swarms which, after long continued droughts, sometimes inundate the colony from the northern wastes." Mr. Cumming informs us that, when pursued, the springbok jumps up into the air 10 or 12 feet, for which they can curve their loins, rise perpendicularly, and the long white hair on their haunches and back floats about. They pass over a space of 10 to 15 feet, come down, and then rise again. After doing this several times, they bound off, arch their necks, then halt and face their enemy. If they come to a place over which men or lions have walked, they jump across it. They can only be compared to locusts, for they eat up every green thing, and always return to their haunts by a different road to which they had previously passed. Their herds consist of tens of thousands, and where they have stayed for some time, thousands of skulls strew the plain. In another part of his book, the same author tells us that the ground was literally covered with them, forming a dense living mass, marching slowly, and pouring like a great river for hours. Hundreds of thousands scarcely tell you their number. "I give you my word," said a boar, "that I have ridden a long day's journey over a succession of flats covered with them as far as I could see, as thick as a sheep standing in a fold." Among the antelopes of the same part of the world is the oryx, or gemsbok, a very beautiful animal, which has been supposed to give us rise to the unicorn of sacred writings. For its long straight horns always so exactly cover one another, when viewing them from a distance they look like one. They have an erect mane, a long tail, and are like a horse, with the head and hoof of an antelope. Their bearing is most noble, and they are the size of an ass, have black bands about the head, looking like a stall collar. They live in almost barren regions, never want water, and are very swift, and only to be caught by riding down. The fierce gnu, or blue wildebeest, of the colonists to the north of the Cape of Good Hope are not as numerous as the springboks, and are easily distinguished by their large curving horns, and the downward carriage of their head, for they can never look up. One was found with a foreleg caught over his horn, and so was easily secured, for he could not, of course, run, and had probably got himself into that attitude when fighting. They have a shaggy head, long hair or mane upon the chest, a long white tail, and wild red eyes. They utter fearful snorts, and kick and leap about in the most grotesque and fantastic manner. If a red handkerchief be held before them, it produces the most violent excitement. End of chapter 30.
Section 31 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee. Goats. The three last genera of which I shall treat are all ruminacea, and are distinguished by their horns, which are divided into cells, and which cells communicate with the skull. The two first, goats and sheep, so closely resemble each other that in many instances the one appears to be a mere variety of the other. If we look at the merino breed, with its closely curled, soft white wool, and then turn to the grave-looking goat, with its long beard and hair, we shall not be conscious of their resemblance. But if we place a sheep that has long resided in, or been born in a tropical country, by the side of the goat, we shall scarcely be able to distinguish one from the other. The wool gradually uncurls, lengthens, and becomes harsh and glossy, and were not the goat's horns directed upwards, and then inclined backwards, those of the sheep directed backwards and returned to the front in a spiral form. Had not the goats, generally speaking, a long beard, and the sheep none, and had not the goats a concave or flat forehead, and the sheep mostly a convex one, we should not be able to separate them, and even these characters, if not well defined, are not very conspicuous, unless to a practiced or careful observer. The chamois, which is classed by many among goats, in some degree approaches the antelopes. Its horns shoot straight up, and then at the tips turn suddenly back, like a fish hook. It frequents all the mountain chains of Europe and Western Asia. In summer climbing to the highest summits and displaying the most daring agility. In the winter it comes down just below the regions of perpetual snow, for the sake of nourishment. Its smell, sight, and hearing are very acute, and it will detect the approach of a hunter at the distance of half a league. When frightened, it bounds from rock to rock, making a strange hissing sound, dashes itself across the most fearful chasms, and throws itself down precipices of 30 feet. It feeds on herbs and flowers and the young shoots of shrubs, seldom drinks, and is extremely fond of salt. As some of the rocks of the Alps contain saltpeter, the chamois has worn holes in them by constant licking. As with other domesticated animals, there are many disputes as to the original country of goats, but most naturalists seem inclined to think that the first stock was placed in Persia. But it is a question involved in much obscurity. In very far off times, when superstition and medicine went hand in hand, and charms were deemed more efficacious than drugs, a hard substance found in the intestines of goats was greatly valued as a cure for most disorders. It was called the bezoar stone, and was a concentration chiefly of resinous bile and magnesia, and the rest inert vegetable matter. It was sold for 10 times its weight in gold, and was said to come from some unknown animal, to increase the mystery belonging to it. Bezoars are now found in oxen, sheep, horses, porcupines, and even the human subject, slightly varying in their concentration, and are often balls of hair, which has been licked off the animal's own coat. The Angora and Cappadocian goats are famed for their long silky hair, which yields beautiful manufactures, but they are far surpassed by the goats of Tibet, the under wool of which is combed off, and made into those shawls which have for years been so famous and so costly. It takes the produce of 10 goats to make a shawl 1.5 yards square. The wool is bleached with rice flour, and the heavy taxes levied upon them makes these unequaled shawls keep up their high price. From the earliest times we read of goats' hair being woven into cloth of varied quality, especially in scriptural writings, and their skins have always afforded valuable leather. That of the kid is of the finest quality. All goats are hardy and wandering in their habits, and frequent those places where no other animal could gain a footing. They exist in a feral state in the mountainous parts of our island, and throughout Europe and Western Asia. There is always much attachment between them and horses, when domesticated. Some say it is in consequence of the strong odor which is emitted by goats, and others because the horse, who so loves companionship, delights in their vivacity. They vigorously defend their young, as the following anecdote will shew. A person, having missed one of his goats, when the flock returned at night, desired 2 boys to watch all night, that she should not get into his young plantation, and nibble off the tops of the trees. At daybreak the watcher looked for the missing animal, and saw her on a pointed rock, at some distance. During the night she had given birth to a kid, and was then defending it from a fox. The latter went round and round, but she turned her horns upon him in all directions. The younger boy went to procure assistance, and the elder hollowed and threw stones to frighten away the marauder. Renard looked at him, saw he was not strong enough to master him, and suddenly tries to seize the kid. All 3 disappeared and were found at the bottom of a precipice. The goat's horns were stuck in the fox. The kid lay stretched beside her, with a lacerated throat, and it was supposed, when the death wound was inflicted by the poor mother, the fox staggered and dragged her and her child with him in his fall. A goat and her kids frequented a square in which I once lived, and were often fed by myself and servants, the circumstance which would have made no impression had I not heard a thumping at the hall door, which arose from the buddings of the goat when the food was not forthcoming, and whose example was followed by the 2 little ones. After a time this remained unheeded, and to our great astonishment one day the area bell used by the tradespeople, and the wire of which passed by the side of one of the railings, was sounded. The cook answered it, but no one was there save the goat and kids, with their heads bent down towards the kitchen window. It was thought that some boy had rung for them, but they were watched, and the old goat was seen to hook one of her horns into the wire and pull it. This is too much like reason to be ascribed to mere instinct. The Caucasian ibex is a goat which affords as much dangerous and exciting sport as the chamois, but is more savage, and has been known to turn round on its pursuer and hurl him down a precipice. It has a remarkable way of throwing itself down these steep places head foremost, so as to light upon its horns, which being elastic bear the shock and save the animal from injury. They pasture in the valleys at night and return during the day to the mountains. In countries where bulls and cows will not live, goats are invaluable. Their flesh is like bad mutton, but long absence from South Downs makes the appetite less dainty, and their kids are very delicate. However, it is chiefly for their good nourishing milk that they are to be prized. The horns of goats are often used by Mussulmans as an antidote to the evil eye. Bishop Heber relates the following anecdote. A monkey came down from a tree to steal the breakfast of a shepherd, who was resting under it with his flock of sheep and goats. He drove the monkey away, who, in his hurry, upset a bee's nest. The insects flew out and attacked not only the intruder, but the goats and sheep underneath. The curious part was to watch the different behavior of the two species. The sheep crowded together, buried their noses in the sand, and did not attempt to resist, but bleated piteously. The goats all ran as fast as they could to an encamping party close by, seeking the assistance of man as dogs would have done. End of section 31, read by Rachel Costello. Section 32 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instincts of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee. Section 32. Sheep. It is but little necessary to descant here on the different fleeces and various flavors of mutton which the numerous breeds of sheep afford. The least reflection and observation teach us their unspeakable value as sources of food, clothing, and other purposes. My task therefore lies with their dispositions and comprehensions. The last anecdote related shews that they have more patience but less courage and resource than the more lively companions with whom they are so frequently associated and whom they so much resemble. In many instances, however, maternal instinct has called forth their powers to a degree which has caused such surprise, and they have been known to traverse considerable distances to seek the assistance of their own kind or of their shepherd when their lambs have been in danger. Moreover, a ram is sometimes a formidable enemy when he thinks any mischief is intended towards the flock of which he is the proud leader. Of the attachment of sheep to their native place, Captain Brown gives a very remarkable instance. A ewe made a journey of 9 days' length to return to her native place with her lamb, and was tracked so completely as to make her owners acquainted with her adventures. Nothing turned her back, and whenever her lamb lagged behind, she urged him on with her impatient bleating. When she reached Stirling, it was the day of an annual fair, and she dared not venture into the crowd. She therefore laid herself down by the roadside with her lamb outside of town, and the next morning early stole through the streets, only terrified at the dogs which she encountered. She came to a toll bar, the keeper of which stopped her, supposing she was a stray animal, and would shortly be claimed. She frequently tried to get through the gate, but was as often prevented, and she patiently turned back. At last she found some means of eluding the obstacle, for on the 9th day she reached her destination with her lamb, where she was repurchased and remained till she died of old age in her 17th year. Sheep have been known, when seized with epidemic disorder, to absent themselves from the rest of the flock, and hide themselves, and many touching stories are told of the artifices of necessity practiced to wean them from their dead offspring, and make them adopt others. Also of the manner in which they remain and watch the inanimate objects of their affection. A gentleman travelling in a lonely part of the Highlands received a strong proof of sagacity in an ewe, who came piteously bleating to meet him. When near, she redoubled her cries, and looked up in his face, as if to ask his assistance. He alighted from his gig and followed her. She led him to a cairn at a considerable distance from the road, where he found a lamb completely wedged in betwixt 2 large stones, and struggling with its legs uppermost. He extricated the sufferer, and placed it on the green sward, and the mother poured forth her thanks in a long and continued bleat. The following history was related by one of the shepherds to whom the circumstance occurred. We were 7 of us grazing the sheep of a rich Bulgarian on the steppe of the Ashshov, and had a flock of 2,000 sheep and 150 goats. It was the month of March, and they were just driven out. The weather was mild, and the grass had appeared, but the wind was bitterly cold in the evening, and it began to rain. The rain soon turned to snow, and our wet cloaks were frozen as hard as boards. A few hours later came a Siberian viuga, or snowdrift, from the northeast, whistling about our ears till seeing or hearing was impossible. We tried to find our way home, from which we were not far distant, but the sheep would not face the wind, and even the goats, who will face anything but a viuga, began to run before the storm. To prevent the flock from scampering away was impossible, and all that could be done was to keep them together. We had to race all night, and in the morning there was nothing but snow all around us. The viuga raged all that day, and the poor sheep were even more wild and frightened than in the night. Sometimes we gave up all as lost, but roused ourselves again and ran with the screaming, bleating flock, while the oxen trotted after with the wagon, and the dogs came howling behind. The poor goats were all lost, or frozen to death the first day, in which we ran at least 50 or 60 versts, leaving a track of dead sheep behind us. In the evening the poor beasts were less wild, being exhausted by hunger and fatigue. 2 of our party reported themselves sick, and crept under the mats and skins in the wagon, and the rest had only time to take a little bread and snow to save life. Night came, no house was near, and this was worse than the preceding. The storm was driving us upon the coast, and we expected to be blown with our stupid cattle into the sea. Another shepherd fell sick, and we thought that night would have been the last for us all. In the morning the wind shifted and drove us towards some houses, which we saw through the drifting snow. But though they were not more than 30 feet away, it was quite impossible to make the foolish sheep turn aside. On they went before the wind, in spite of all we could do, and we soon lost sight of the houses. Their inhabitants, however, had heard the howling of the dogs, and about 20 came to our assistance. We then managed to turn the sheep and drive them under sheds and into houses. All the goats and 500 sheep were lost. Many died after they got under shelter, for in their fright they crowded so close together that they were smothered. Half a verst farther, and we should have come to the coast, rising 25 fathoms above the sea. The above gives a lively picture of sufferings which are unknown to us, and in which the dogs seem to have been less efficacious than our own excellent breed. End of section 32, read by Rachel Costello. Section 33 of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anecdotes of the Habits and Instinct of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee. Oxen. The widely distributed genus Bos has horns in both sexes, and in it we find the largest of the Ruminacea. They, generally speaking, have comparatively short legs and heavy, massive bodies. The perfection of domestic oxen is said to be a resemblance to a box set upon 4 posts, but in some of the wilder species, an arched back is certainly a beauty. Their foreheads are very wide and mostly flat, their ears large and projecting from the sides of the head, their muzzle broad, destitute of hair, and always moist. A long ridge passes across the top of the forehead, from which proceed 2 horns, more or less curved, sometimes of great length, always tapering to a point and having a bony core. Their neck is thick, and from it hangs a dewlap, which passes between the forelegs. The hoofs are cleft. Of the origin of these ruminants. We know absolutely nothing, for they are spoken of as domesticated animals from the earliest times. And although there are such things as wild tribes now existing, we are not sure whether they were placed where they are with their present characters, or whether all are modifications of one pair according to circumstances. The most conspicuous among them are the zebu, the buffalo, the bison, and the bulls of various parts of the Old World. Those cattle which roam about in a free state in South America, New Zealand, and Australia have not very long escaped from the dominion of man. In India, some of the heathen natives make a certain ox a sacred animal. The Brahmins worship it, and it is a distinct variety from the common working oxen, who are by no means treated kindly. The cherished sorts are very sleek and tame, and even voluntarily go up to strangers who have grass in their hands, and eat from them. They are, however, troublesome, as all pets are, and no one will dare to check them, for they must not be struck. Near Calcutta, they often break into gardens, put their noses into pastry cooks' and fruiterers' shops, and have not the least hesitation, when they are affronted, in going up to the offenders and giving them a poke with their horns. The zebus are spread over India, China, the archipelago, Madagascar, and several parts of Africa. They are distinguished by a hump of fat between their shoulders, and they are as good for the saddle as for the drought. They are more active and agile than we can imagine them to be. Accustomed as we are to the slow, heavy pace of others of the tribe, they go with ease at the rate of 6 miles an hour, and travel for 15 or 16 hours in the day. Their paces are very agreeable, and being wholly without the circular motion of the hind legs, which makes ours so tiring to ride. They will go over a 5-barred gate, as well as the best hunter, are equally good for the plough, or for threshing corn, and the white are the most esteemed. The gale affords the richest milk, and prefers feeding on trees. It also comes from India. It is gentle even in its wild state, and runs away from, but never faces man. The gaurs are much more formidable than the preceding, and the Indians say the tiger has no chance with them when full grown. They also eat trees and grass, and will not live in captivity. They grow to an immense size. Their back is arched, and a very thick ridge rises upon it, which subsides towards the tail. The yak has narrow nostrils, the ears small and pointed, the forehead covered with black curling hair, that on the back is smooth, and of a dark brown or black color, with one white stripe on the withers, and another on the croup. The shoulders, sides, inside of thighs, and under part of the body are covered with a mane of hair, which almost reaches the ground, and is of a grizzled black with a central line of white along the belly. The tail is a large mass of glossy coarse hair, quite white, and from 18 to 20 inches long. The horns are small, pointed, and curved forwards. The animal is said to be very wild and mischievous, but it can be tamed. The tails were used by the Mongols and Tartars as standards, and throughout the East are now fitted into ivory handles, and form brushes for driving away the flies. The yaks are dull-looking animals and make a low grunting noise, causing them to be known in Europe as the grunting cow. They are very useful when domesticated, and yield an abundance of milk. Not many years ago, they were objects of mystery, and those who traveled to collect the curiosities of nature were ordered to ascertain their attributes, almost their existence, the tails alone having reached Europe. Buffaloes are heavier and clumsier animals than the ox, and are covered with coarser hair. They are very wild and savage, rush upon the tiger, crush and trample him to death. They delight in those steamy marshes which are pestilential to other beings, and wallow in stagnant water. Their hide is particularly tough, their flesh hard, and their milk delicious. They are sometimes trained to be very useful, especially where rivers are apt to be swollen, for they do not fear to breast any torrent, however violent it may be in its course. They are spread over India, China, and various parts of Africa, have been introduced into Spain and Italy, and wherever they live, malaria is sure to exist. The Cape buffalo is said to be more than a match for the lion, who only overcomes him by some cunning stratagem, or springs upon him when he is drinking. If, however, others of the herd come to his assistance, the lion is either vanquished or obliged to decamp. A herd consisting of 7 wild buffaloes with 1 calf was discovered in Hindustan, and 4 gentlemen proceeded to hunt them. After having followed them for 3 miles, the young ones separated from the herd and joined some tame cattle belonging to a neighboring village. It was killed by the party, who afterwards continued the pursuit of the old ones, and they were overtaken in a high grass jungle 4 miles further off. They were quickly driven from this place and closely followed for more than 6 miles over a plain. At length the party succeeded in separating 1 buffalo from the herd. Here the encounter began. After receiving several wounds, he still continued his flight. He suddenly halted and kept his pursuers at bay. After a short interval he again fled, was pursued and wounded as before, carrying the spears sticking in his back and sides for several hundred yards. Lieutenant White of the 15th N.I. rode up very close to him, threw his spear, and wounded the animal in the loins. His horse, being much exhausted, was unable to wheel round before the buffalo turned about and charged with such vigor that both horse and rider were overthrown and lay many yards distant. Fortunately, the lieutenant received no injury, and when the animal approached, he had the presence of mind to lie flat on his back. The beast approached, but stood at his feet without offering any violence. The other sportsmen called repeatedly to their companion to arise and escape. For some time, however, he disregarded their advice, fearful of the consequences. At length, in compliance with their entreaty, he arose. The buffalo instantly rushed forward, but Mr. White escaped by again throwing himself down, while the enraged beast, missing his aim, fell on the ground, his horse grazing Mr. White's back as he passed over him. After this lucky escape, he seized the favorable opportunity and regained his horse. The buffalo then took refuge in a tank, and when his former opponent joined his companions, who were standing on the bank, the animal issued forth, and selecting Lieutenant White for the object of his vengeance, pursued him to a considerable distance. The buffalo was now rendered quite furious, and attacked everything within his reach, such as cows and dogs. Unfortunately, an old woman passed, and became the victim of his rage. She was taken up without any appearance of life, having her arms broken and many wounds. The horsemen were too fatigued to renew the attack, and the buffaloes, having gained a victory, continued their course without further molestation. Mr. Pringle describes the Cape buffalo to be a very formidable and powerful animal, considerably larger than the domestic ox, the bony pad on his forehead making a complete helmet, and it is impossible to pierce him with bullets which have not been hardened by tin. He is said to be fierce, treacherous, and savage, and even when not provoked, will attack any man who strays near his haunts, skulking in the jungle when he sees them approach, and then suddenly rushing out upon them. If he kill a man, he stands over him for some time, trampling on him with his hoofs, crushing him with his knees, mangling him with his horns, and stripping off his skin with his rough and prickly tongue. He goes away and returns again and again, as if he could not sufficiently glut his vengeance. A party of Boers had gone out to hunt a herd of buffaloes, which were grazing on a piece of marshy ground. As they could not get within shot of the game without crossing part of the marsh, which was not safe for the horses, they agreed to leave them in charge of the Hottentots, and advanced on foot, thinking that if any of the buffaloes should turn upon them, it would be easy to escape by retreating across the quagmire, which, though passable for man, would not support the weight of a heavy quadruped. They advanced accordingly, and under covert of the bushes, approached the game with such advantage that the first volley brought down 3 of the fattest of the herd, and so severely wounded the great bull leader that he dropped on his knees, bellowing furiously. Thinking him mortally wounded, the foremost of the huntsmen issued from the covert and began reloading his musket as he advanced, to give him a finishing shot. But no sooner did the infuriated animal see his foe in front of him than he sprang up and rushed headlong upon him. The man, throwing down his heavy gun, fled towards the quagmire, but the beast was so close upon him that he despaired of escaping in that direction, and turning suddenly round a clump of copsewood, began to climb an old mimosa tree which stood at one side of it. The raging beast, however, was too quick for him. Bounding forward with a roar, which my informant described as being one of the most frightful sounds he ever heard, he caught the unfortunate man with his terrible horns, just as he had nearly escaped his reach, and tossed him into the air with such force that the body fell dreadfully mangled into a cleft of the tree. The buffalo ran round the tree once or twice, apparently looking for the man, until, weakened with loss of blood, he again sank on his knees. The rest of the party, recovering from their confusion, then came up and dispatched him, though too late to save their comrade, whose body was hanging in the tree quite dead. The aurochs is the European bison, and is one of the largest and noblest of the genus. He stands 6 feet high at the shoulders, has 2 sorts of hair, one short, soft, and woolly, and the other long, rough, and covering the upper part and sides of the head, the chest, neck, and shoulders, forming an enormous mane, sometimes a foot long. The tongue, lips, and palate have a bluish tint. The eyes are small and piercing. An odor resembling both musk and violets exudes from the skin, especially that part which covers the convex forehead and which may be smelt at a distance of 100 yards. Their flesh is much esteemed. They live in thickets near swamps, come out at night to eat the bark of young trees, lichens, and young shoots. Carry their head low, are never completely tamed, detest the common bull, and their only attachment to human beings is bestowed on their keepers. They are now rare. A few are found in Lithuania and Poland, but they used to inhabit all the European forests. The American bison, now familiarly called a buffalo, exist in vast herds in the prairies of the New World. A mob of them, as a herd is called, is irresistible, destroys everything over which it passes, numbers hundreds of thousands, and rushes like a cataract over the plains with a noise resembling that of thunder. They are very dangerous animals to attack, hence the sport they afford is more exciting. For graphic pictures of it, I would advise my readers to peruse the pages of Mr. Catlin. They delight in salt springs and morasses. The bulls sometimes fight furiously with each other. Their greatest enemy is the grizzly bear, who frequently brings them down, and they have no antipathy to the common ox, like their European brethren. Mr. Bryan shot one, and the bullet passed completely through him, almost cutting his heart in 2, and yet he ran half a mile before he fell. The musk oxen live in the high latitudes of North America, are very small, but look larger than they are, from the quantity of long woolly hair with which they are covered, and which often reaches the ground. Their flesh smells strongly of musk, and they are easily irritated. Some stockings made from their long fleece have been said to equal those manufactured with silk. The Chillingham Park cattle are very handsome, being white with red ears and black muzzle, Their horns are also white with black tips, and greatly resemble our Devonshire breed, which is thought to approach nearer than any other to the Welsh wild cattle of ancient times. They are fleet, bold, and active, hide their calves for the first week after they are born, and are at all times dangerous to approach. Like the sheep, there are so many breeds of oxen in this country that the plan of my work cannot embrace them. They are a most important item in the riches of England, and few are insensible to the merits of our cheese and roast beef. We are not exactly on the same terms with our oxen as the Swiss are with theirs, with whom they form a part of the family, and where they are adorned with gay trappings and expensive bells. But our cows are familiar friends, coming when they are called, of themselves returning to the farm at milking time, and evincing great affection. I have not seen it stated elsewhere, but I have been told many times that it is necessary to milk the cow always on the same side, or she kicks and rebels. Our bulls are sometimes fierce, but are much under the influence of voice and gesture. Both sexes will give notice of approaching rain after a drought, and are very inquisitive. Mr. Bell gives us the following anecdote, which was witnessed by one of his near relatives. A cow which was feeding tranquilly in a pasture, the gate of which was open to the road, was much annoyed by a mischievous boy, who amused himself by throwing stones at the peaceful animal, who, after bearing with his impertinence for some time, at length went up to him, hooked the end of her horn into his clothes, and lifting him from the ground, carried him out of the field, and laid him down in the road. She then calmly returned to her pasture, leaving him quit with a severe fright and a torn garment. In Mr. Byam's Central America, I find this interesting history, with which I conclude the present series of anecdotes. A bull had gored so many cattle that he was lassoed, and his horns blunted at the tips, to prevent further mischief. A few weeks after, a panther, jaguar, killed a cow, and from the torn condition of the bull's head and neck, and the trampled state of the ground, he had evidently done battle for the cow. He was secured, his wounds plastered up, his horns made sharp again, and turned out into the savannah. The wild dogs and vultures having been kept from the body of the cow during the day, the panther returned to his feast at night, and a furious engagement took place between him and the bull, for the former was found dead, close by the cow the next morning, pierced through and through. The bull returned again and again to him with fury, and was himself again wounded, but his gashes were sewn up, and he remained so fierce that his horns were obliged to be reblunted.
End of section 33. End of Anecdotes of the Habits and Instincts of Animals by Mrs. Robert Lee.